You don't remember the exact moment it changed. There wasn't a fight. There wasn't a goodbye. There was just less. Less initiative, less curiosity, less effort that came without being asked. You notice you are the one checking in first. You notice plans only happen after you bring them up. You notice the conversations feel lighter, but emptier. When you ask how they're doing, they answer. When you stop asking, they don't reach out. You tell yourself it's normal, that relationships settle, that the excitement fades, and this is what stability looks like. But something about it doesn't feel stable. It feels unattended. You reread old messages, not because you miss the words, but because you're trying to remember when effort was mutual. You start filling the silence, checking more, explaining more, giving more space while quietly hoping they'll step in. And when they don't, your mind looks for the softest explanation. They lost feelings. The spark died. This just happens sometimes. That explanation hurts, but it's familiar, and it lets you avoid a harder question. Because saying someone lost feelings sounds tragic. Saying they stopped trying sounds deliberate, and you don't want to believe that. So you wait, you adjust, you lower expectations and call it understanding. But deep down there's a tension you can't name yet, because love doesn't disappear quietly. Effort does. And once you feel that absence, you can't unfeel it. Once that absence settles in, your mind starts building a story that makes it easier to live with. You tell yourself they're overwhelmed, that work is heavy, that life pulled their attention somewhere else. You look for emotional reasons because emotional reasons feel gentle. Maybe they're scared of commitment. Maybe they've been hurt before. Maybe they don't know how to express what they feel. You give them the benefit of every doubt, sometimes more than they ask for. And when effort doesn't return, you don't question the effort itself. You question the feeling behind it. They must be losing feelings. The spark must be fading. This is just how love goes. That explanation hurts, but it doesn't accuse anyone. It lets you grieve without confronting. It lets you stay patient without asking for more. It lets you keep showing up without changing anything. So you soften your expectations. You stop asking why plans aren't initiated. You stop pointing out the imbalance. You tell yourself you're being mature, that you're not needy, that you're not demanding. You convince yourself that love means understanding someone even when they stop meeting you halfway. And the more you repeat that story, the more reasonable it sounds. Because feelings are mysterious. They fade, they fluctuate. No one has to be responsible for that. But there's a problem with this explanation, one you don't see yet. Because while you're busy protecting the idea of their feelings, you're ignoring something much more concrete. You're ignoring behavior. And behavior doesn't disappear because of mystery. It disappears because it's no longer required. You're close now, closer than you realize, to understanding what actually changed.
Behavior doesn't fade by accident. It fades when the environment allows it to. Effort stops when it no longer feels necessary, not because someone suddenly stops caring, but because caring no longer requires action. When presence feels guaranteed, initiative becomes optional. When inconsistency carries no cost, consistency loses its value. And slowly, without any dramatic decision, one person starts doing less because the other keeps compensating. You fill the gaps. You initiate the conversations. You reschedule. You explain things away before they have to. Not because you're afraid to lose them, but because you believe relationships need maintenance. And they do. But there's a difference between maintaining something together and maintaining it alone. When one person keeps the connection alive by default, the other learns they don't need to try. They don't need to plan ahead. They don't need to check in first. They don't need to risk losing you to feel your absence. You're already there. So effort becomes reactive instead of intentional. They show up when prompted. They engage when reminded. They care, but passively. And that's the part that's hard to accept. They didn't wake up deciding to pull away. They just stopped pushing forward. Because pushing forward requires pressure, and pressure only exists when something can be lost. This isn't manipulation. It isn't cruelty. It isn't a lack of feelings. It's what happens when one person carries the weight long enough that the other forgets it's heavy. And by the time you notice the imbalance, it already feels normal to them. That's why the change feels confusing, because nothing happened, except trying quietly stopped. And once you see that, the story about fading feelings starts to sound incomplete.
This is the moment things become clear. Not emotionally, structurally. They didn't lose feelings first. They lost interest in trying. And once trying stopped, feelings followed. That order matters, because it changes what you blame and who you stop blaming. You weren't witnessing the mystery of love fading. You were watching effort slowly get removed from the equation. No arguments, no dramatic exits, no honest conversations about what changed, just fewer actions, less initiative, less presence that wasn't prompted. They still cared, in theory, but caring without effort doesn't hold a relationship together. It just keeps it from officially ending. And you felt that difference long before you could name it. You felt it in the silence you kept filling, in the plans you kept initiating, in the patience you kept extending while nothing adjusted on the other side. The realization isn't that they didn't care, it's that caring became passive, and passive care looks a lot like indifference when you're the one doing the work. That's why waiting didn't help. That's why understanding didn't fix it. That's why being patient only stretched the distance. Because you weren't waiting for feelings to come back, you were waiting for effort to return, and effort doesn't return on its own when nothing requires it to. Once you see that, the confusion lifts, and what's left isn't heartbreak, it's clarity. Once that clarity settles, another question surfaces, one you've been avoiding. Why did you stay? Not out of weakness, not because you didn't see the shift. You stayed because history feels heavier than absence. Because you remember how it used to be and assume that version could return. You told yourself effort comes in waves, that people go through phases, that patience is proof of maturity. So you waited. You stayed quiet when things felt uneven. You chose understanding over confrontation. You convinced yourself that asking for more would make you look demanding. And part of you believed that if you held steady long enough, they would meet you there again. You didn't want to pressure them. You didn't want to be the reason things broke. So you adjusted instead. You accepted less initiative, less presence, less consistency. Not because you wanted less, but because you hoped it was temporary. And that hope kept you invested, even when the return stopped coming. There's nothing shameful about that. Loyalty feels like strength when you don't want to give up on something real. But loyalty without reciprocity quietly turns into self-neglect. Because while you were protecting the connection, you were also absorbing the cost of its imbalance. You weren't staying for what it was, you were staying for what it had been. And once you see that distinction, you stop confusing patience with progress. You realize something important. Staying didn't fail because you cared too much. It failed because effort never came back to meet you. Once you stop explaining their absence for them, interest starts to look very different. Not louder, not more dramatic, clearer. Real interest shows up without reminders. It doesn't need to be chased into existence. It doesn't rely on you carrying the momentum alone. It looks like initiative, plans made before you ask, questions asked because they want to know, not because silence feels awkward. It looks like consistency, not perfection, not constant intensity, just steady presence that doesn't disappear when things get comfortable. Real interest doesn't hide behind potential. It doesn't ask you to wait indefinitely for effort to return, and it doesn't make you guess whether you matter. This is where the confusion usually starts, because feelings can still exist even when interest is gone. Someone can care about you and still stop trying. They can like you, miss you, think about you, and still choose not to invest. That's why words don't mean much here, and reassurance doesn't fix it. Interest reveals itself through action, through what someone does when no one is watching and nothing is being asked. When effort is mutual, you don't have to manage the connection. You don't have to monitor distance. You don't have to negotiate presence. You feel met, not because they're afraid to lose you, but because they don't want to. And once you experience that difference, it becomes impossible to mistake effort for interest again. Because real interest doesn't fade quietly, it stays visible.
The shift forward doesn't come with anger. It doesn't come with speeches or ultimatums. It comes quietly. You stop chasing clarity that someone else isn't willing to provide. You stop filling silence that isn't yours to fill. Not to punish, not to teach a lesson, but because you finally understand what effort without reciprocity really is. It's not love, it's maintenance. You stop proving your value to someone who stopped investing in it. You stop mistaking patience for progress. And the relief doesn't come from letting go of them. It comes from letting go of the explanation that kept you stuck. They didn't lose feelings. They lost interest in trying. And once you see that, you stop replaying conversations. You stop wondering what you could have done differently. You stop blaming yourself for someone else's decision to stop showing up. Because effort is a choice, and so is not making it. You don't harden. You don't close off. You simply move forward with a clearer standard. One where interest doesn't have to be guessed, where effort doesn't have to be managed, and where love doesn't quietly disappear while you're still trying to hold it together. That's not loss, that's clarity.